Hello, 012 group. This is Colonel Gallagher from his home, and I'm just going to give you a very brief one because I have a session here in a little bit uh, on the iron dice. And I sent you a write-up, check your group email, and it has to do with how you want to approach this. Now, when you read the iron dice, this right here, this is what your upcoming essay is about next week on Monday. And read about that as well in the group email. What you want to do, and I told you, only read the first 2 pages in the beginning. It's the intro. Read up to where it says the Kaiser's fateful pledge. And the reason is Stossinger's setting us up for something. Now you gotta understand, historians for the longest time have fixated on the causes of World War I. And Stossinger points out that's not really what he's worried about. What he's worried about is how did this war come about? And his whole sole question is one thing. Was the war inevitable? Now, if you're not sure about inevitable, look it up. But it really means, in his mind, could the war have been avoided? Now, we like to think, and this is what Stasha says, and even historians think, well, there's nothing you could have done. Now, that's exactly what they said. Even look at the title, the Iron Dice, right? Where does the title come from? It comes from the German minister's own quote, who said, if the iron dice must roll, may God help us. In other words, there's nothing we can do. They're almost blaming God for this. Well, when you think about that, how events transpire, if you buy into this, that it was because of imperialism and nationalism and so on like this, that many events control men, and men have no control. This is really about the word NMMI we always talk about, leadership. And when you think of this, if you buy into the idea that it's inevitable, that meant the leadership has no responsibility. Think on that very carefully. Just as much as Princip, Gavrilo Princip, had what? Responsibility for the act he did. And he killed the Duke. And I've had some of you say, well, this was the right thing to do. And I'm thinking, so murdering the Duke was good? You got to think. You're not thinking. You're just kind of reacting, and you're just putting something in. Ultimately, this is one of the great questions. Think on this. Is war inevitable? That means man has no responsibility whatsoever. I'll take you up to today here in a minute. If you think of the alliance system, everyone usually said, when I was younger too, they said the alliance system is what everyone got sucked in. But at some point, if there's an alliance system there between Germany and Austria, could Germany, the Kaiser, not have done something different? Okay, to stop this? Ultimately, what happened? This war developed from a localized conflict. So think of it today this way. A localized incident ballooned into a global problem. Sound familiar today? And yet everyone worries about blame versus how do we learn from this and what's the next step to prevention, not the pound of cure. Because the pound of cure, when you read the very first page, is an interesting piece where they all believed a couple things. One, the war would be short. And I told you a video on this. We'll all be home by Christmas. One of the great lines in there, you gentlemen will be home before the leaves have fallen. Well, a lot more people are going to fall. The death toll is astronomical. And if you look at my video on the Verdun and the Somme, that's why I gave that to you. The other part of it is they said it'll all be over by Christmas. The problem is they didn't tell you what year. And now you're sucking this entire massive generation of Russians, Germans, Brits, French, and the list goes on, including Americans, and they're going to lose their lives for what? What was the war about? What was it to accomplish? And as D.H. Lawrence, quote he used in the very first part, a very famous writer, D.H. Lawrence said, all of the great words have been erased. Think of it. Europe was the center of science. It was the center of the Renaissance in one part, right? It was the center of the Enlightenment. Here it was, the center of civilization and culture. And what did they reduce themselves to? They had left the world of reason and exchanged it for a world of violence. And I've had one student that wrote this wonderful piece on it. You were so right. I'm not going to mention your names. I can't, in this type of format. But I was so proud of you. And I wrote back to you. You had it right. Something had happened. There was something symptomatic in Europe. They had left their senses. It was a failure of leadership, we could argue. And that's what Stossinger does. He says, let's talk about this. It's a very important lesson for you for the rest of your lives. It is not just simply something I want you to write. And if you don't see some depth and some meaning to this, something beyond just, it's an assignment, then I feel bad for you. Okay, I really do. But think about it. I did send some things to you. Make sure you look at that. Certainly, you have the three I pointed out: the German Kaiser, the Austrian minister, Berchtold, and then last but not least, the third guy, and I told you who it was. Yeah, you can have in the third category the Russian Tsar, but also Russian Tsar's minister, Sazonov. Now, if these names are not familiar, you're not reading. Okay, but first thing is look at the first intro 2 pages and ask questions more than just write things down. Think on it. Is war inevitable? Could this have been avoided? And at what point? Okay, and if you think about this more, if the Archduke was shot, when he was shot, not if, when the Archduke was shot, he's a member of royalty, that crown on his head. How did other royals agree to this? They didn't. They were shocked and horrified. So the question to me would be, then why in the world would the Russian Tsar, who is got a crown himself, not be in support of Serbia being punished, saying this was the wrong thing to do? Think on these things, because this is really where that gray matter attaches itself to you and to your life. Okay. Think of leadership, my friends. Okay. Thank you. Come to a session. I'm so lonely, and I'll see you. Okay. Bye bye.